At exactly 9 a.m., a black man in khakis and a light blue button-down stepped into the pristine marble foyer of Bennett Financial's downtown Chicago branch. He looked like any other customer, quiet, unassuming, respectful. He approached the counter for a routine $15,000 withdrawal from his personal account. No alarms, no red flags, just business as usual. But then came the pause, the look, the subtle curl of disdain on the teller's lips, and then the cold rejection. "We can't process this." No explanation, no verification, just suspicion in her eyes, as if his skin alone was cause for security concern. Within minutes, he was forcibly dragged out of the building, while other white customers walked away with larger withdrawals, unbothered, unquestioned. No one asked who he was. No one knew who he was. And that's where they made their first mistake. Because the man they just threw out like a criminal wasn't just any customer. He was Marcus Bennett, the founder, the CEO, and the owner of the very institution they used to humiliate him. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Marcus Bennett didn't flinch when the door shut behind him. The cold morning air of Chicago bit at his skin, but not nearly as sharp as the looks he had just received from within his own bank. Standing on the pavement outside the institution he had spent years building from scratch, he held his ground. He didn't pace. He didn't call for a lawyer. He didn't shout. He just stood there, silent, still, collecting the storm rising behind his calm eyes. Inside, the bank continued like nothing had happened. No one rushed to the door to apologize. No one followed to explain. Victoria Sanders, the manager who had watched the entire confrontation through the glass-walled office, had returned to her perch, arms folded, satisfied. Amy Carter, the teller who had denied Marcus with a pinched tone and a glance full of judgment, was chatting with another employee, her smirk still faintly visible. They thought it was over, that the threat had been removed, that they had done the right thing by playing it safe. But outside, Marcus's fingers gripped his wallet tightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, fury he refused to release. Not yet, because Marcus Bennett didn't rise to CEO by losing control. He'd built Bennett Financial from a tiny startup in the South Side into a national powerhouse precisely because he had learned when to remain silent and when to strike. From his position on the sidewalk, he watched a white man in a tailored charcoal suit exit the branch, a stack of cash neatly tucked in his coat pocket. No one stopped him. No extra paperwork. No security. No questions. Just a warm smile and a, "Have a great day, sir," from the same teller who had looked at Marcus like he was a thief. Marcus's jaw clenched for a moment before he consciously relaxed it. He had seen this play out before, just not in his own building. He glanced down at the polished brass plaque embedded in the stone exterior. Bennett Financial, Chicago flagship branch, his name, his legacy, and inside they had tossed him out like a trespasser. The injustice didn't burn with the fury of surprise, it burned with the weight of familiarity. This wasn't new. It was an old wound with fresh salt. He had been followed in stores as a teenager, had been asked to repeat himself in meetings even when his ideas built the foundations of million-dollar contracts. He had watched colleagues get handshakes while he got questioned, but never here, never in his house. Through the wide glass doors, Marcus saw Ethan Reynolds, the security guard, resume his post at the entrance. Ethan had been the one to lay hands on him, rough, indifferent, mechanical, not a word of apology, not a glance of doubt, just force. And worse yet, the others had watched. The tellers, the customers. The woman in the corner, Lisa Parker, he'd read from her purse tag, had locked eyes with him for a brief moment. A flicker of concern had passed across her face, but it died quickly. She turned away, hands tightening on her bag. A witness, yes, but not an ally. She would tell the story at dinner tonight, probably. She wouldn't lie, but she wouldn't have intervened either. Marcus turned his back to the building for a moment, closing his eyes. He could hear the dull hum of traffic behind him, the shuffle of hurried feet on the sidewalk, the muted sounds of a city that kept moving no matter what happened to you. He took a breath, held it, released it. He didn't pace, he didn't curse. He stood. Across the street, a teenage boy watched him curiously. Marcus caught his gaze, gave the faintest nod, The boy nodded back, and that was enough. A silent understanding passed between them, the kind of understanding born not of words, but of experience. Moments later, the glass doors opened again. Marcus turned slightly as Jamal Brooks stepped outside. Another security guard, black, mid-30s, and carrying the weight of someone who had seen far too much for his age. Jamal didn't speak at first. He just walked over to where Marcus stood and bent down without a word. Gently, with deliberate fingers, he picked up the discarded ID that Ethan had thrown onto the pavement. He wiped it off against the sleeve of his jacket, held it out to Marcus with both hands. "Sir," he said softly. Marcus took it in silence. Their fingers brushed for a second, and in that touch was an entire conversation. Jamal didn't look away. He didn't offer pity or apology, just a tired kind of respect. "This place," Jamal murmured under his breath, "always does this." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He just studied the man's face, the worn weariness in his eyes. "It doesn't matter," Jamal continued, his voice low. "If you've got the degrees, the title, the suit, they don't see that. They just see you." There was no anger in his tone, only exhaustion, as if this were just another Monday in America. "We're the numbers they show in hiring reports," Jamal added, "but we're not welcome. Not in the offices, not at the counters, and sure as hell not in the boardrooms." Marcus finally spoke, his voice even. "Not for long." Jamal met his gaze. "Yeah?" "Yeah," Marcus said, slipping his ID back into his wallet. "You'll want to be here when it happens." Jamal smiled faintly. Just enough. And Marcus reached for his phone. Marcus Bennett stood outside the glass walls of the institution that bore his name. No longer just a man who had been humiliated, but a force of reckoning waiting to be unleashed. As he tapped on his phone with quiet precision, Jamal stood beside him, watchful, solemn, and aware that something seismic was about to erupt from this silence. The phone rang once, then twice. "David Carter," a voice answered crisply on the other end. "I need you at the Chicago branch. Now." There was a pause. No explanation was necessary. David understood. "I'll be there in 15, he said, already moving. Marcus ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. Inside the bank, behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, business continued like a machine too arrogant to believe it could be interrupted. Victoria Sanders paced behind the customer service counter, speaking to Amy with the kind of efficient contempt reserved for employees who couldn't even properly carry out a quiet removal. Ethan, the guard, remained stationed at the entrance like a bouncer outside a nightclub, watching but avoiding direct eye contact with the man he had shoved out only moments ago. Marcus didn't need to be inside to read their minds. They thought they had won. They thought they had disposed of a nuisance. They didn't know they had just thrown out the man who built the very floor they were standing on. Minutes passed. Jamal shifted his weight from one leg to the other, casting wary glances at the front doors. "You sure you don't want to call ahead and give them a heads up?" he asked quietly. Marcus didn't answer at first. Then, with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, he said, "Let them feel safe." At exactly 9:34 a.m., a black Audi pulled up to the curb. The doors hadn't even fully opened when David Carter, Marcus's chief operating officer and longtime friend, stepped out. Tailored suit, salt and pepper hair, a gaze that cut like polished steel. His shoes clicked crisply against the concrete as he approached the building. Not a second wasted. Ethan straightened the moment he saw him. His posture stiffened, his expression flickered. Recognition dawned too late. David didn't break stride, didn't acknowledge the guard at all. He walked past him like he didn't exist. The bank's glass doors swung open. Marcus stepped in behind him. Jamal hesitated at the threshold. He wasn't sure if he was meant to follow. Then Marcus gave the subtlest nod. Jamal entered. Victoria was mid-sentence when she spotted David. Her tone faltered. Her body tensed. "Mr. Carter," she said, caught between forced calm and dawning panic. "I wasn't expecting—" "You weren't supposed to," David cut in. Amy's face paled behind her monitor. She began to rise from her chair, hands fidgeting with a pen she no longer needed to hold. David turned slightly, gesturing to Marcus. Would someone like to explain why my CEO was forcibly removed from his own bank? A thick silence dropped across the room. Tellers froze mid-transaction. Customers glanced up from their phones. Even the chime of the service bell at the far end of the room seemed to hold its breath. Victoria swallowed visibly, struggling to recover her composure. "There must be a misunderstanding," she offered, voice brittle. "Oh, there is no misunderstanding," David replied. "There is only a very public failure in judgment." His tone never rose. It didn't need to. He turned to Amy, who looked like she was about to cry. "Did you or did you not refuse this man's withdrawal?" Amy's throat bobbed. I I was following protocol." "Is that what you call it now?" David snapped. "Blatant racial profiling?" "Protocol?" Amy's lips quivered. No sound came out. "Victoria," David said, spinning toward the manager, "did you verify Mr. Bennett's account before deciding he wasn't eligible to withdraw his own funds?" Victoria hesitated. "Just a second too long. That's all I needed to know." David turned to Marcus. "You want this branch cleaned out?" "Completely," Marcus said without hesitation. Victoria's face drained of color. "Sir Dash." "Effective immediately," David continued, silencing her. "Everyone involved in this incident is suspended. You will be investigated for misconduct, and if I find any trace of this behavior affecting other customers." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Ethan looked away. Amy sat down slowly, face crumpling with dread. Victoria opened her mouth again, but couldn't summon any words. Then David turned to Jamal. "And you?" Jamal straightened, not sure whether to speak. "You're promoted," David said. Jamal's eyes widened. "Sir?" "You deserve better than this," David replied. "Starting today, you'll be the new floor supervisor. Effective immediately." Jamal's voice cracked. "Thank you, sir." David gave a short nod. Then he stepped aside. Marcus walked back to the counter where Amy sat trembling. Without looking at her, he pointed to the terminal. "Process the withdrawal." Amy nodded quickly, typing with shaking hands. Within seconds, crisp stacks of bills were neatly stacked on the counter. Marcus picked them up. His money, his right. Then he turned to Jamal, slid one of the stacks toward him. "Take the day off," Marcus said simply. Jamal hesitated, then accepted the cash with quiet understanding. Marcus turned one last time to Victoria. "You should have checked my ID." And with that, he walked out, not escorted, not questioned, but with every head turned in silent recognition. A man who had walked in a customer and walked out a storm. As Marcus stepped out of the bank, the morning air felt sharper, no longer cold, but electric, the kind of air that crackles just before a lightning strike. Behind him, the glass doors of Bennett Financial didn't close quietly. They thudded shut, as if sealing off the end of a chapter written in arrogance. But this wasn't over. This was never just about one branch, one manager, one ignorant teller. This was about the rot that had crept in while no one was watching. And Marcus Bennett was done watching. Inside the black Audi waiting at the curb, Marcus didn't say a word as he slid into the passenger seat. David Carter climbed in beside him, already pulling out his tablet. "We need a full audit," Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. "I want every branch reviewed, every transaction over $5,000, every customer complaint, every security incident." David nodded grimly. "Already drafted the request. I'll push it through legal by noon." "Not legal," Marcus cut in. "Internal affairs. Quiet. Controlled. We don't alert anyone until we know exactly how deep this goes." David paused, absorbing the weight of that statement. Then, "You think this wasn't isolated?" "I know it wasn't." Marcus stared out the window, watching as pedestrians hurried past, oblivious to the war that had just begun behind the glass. A few recognized him. Some glanced once, then did double takes, phones quietly raised. It didn't matter. Let them record. Let them spread it. This needed to be seen. This needed to be heard. He turned back to David. "Start with Victoria Sanders. I want every hire she made, every promotion she approved, and every internal report she suppressed." David's fingers tapped the screen with mechanical speed. "Amy Carter, too?" Marcus nodded. "And Ethan Reynolds. I want to know who hired him, and why a man like that was given authority to put hands on a customer without verification. David looked up. You mean you? Marcus smiled grimly. I mean any customer. That's the point. Across the city, in a glass tower bearing the Bennett Financial logo, a flurry of emails began to fly. HR was notified. Compliance was looped in. An emergency meeting with department heads was scheduled for 3 p.m. But Marcus wasn't heading there. Not yet. Instead, he asked the driver to reroute. Take me to South Side. David glanced over. You sure? Marcus's eyes narrowed. I want to see where they didn't think I'd show up. 10 minutes later, the car pulled up outside a modest Bennett Financial branch tucked between a pharmacy and a grocery store. No marble floors, no concierge service, just a weather-worn sign and a single security guard nodding off beside the ATM. Marcus stepped out alone. As he entered, a chime echoed across the room. A young black woman behind the counter looked up. Her name tag read Danielle Mendez. Her expression brightened with recognition. Good morning, Mr. Bennett, she said, standing up immediately. It's an honor. He smiled. Morning, Danielle. I'm here as a customer today. She nodded. Absolutely, how can I help? No special treatment, just a regular withdrawal. She didn't hesitate. Of course, sir. May I see your ID? He handed it over. She examined it carefully, scanned it, verified his account, and then said the words he hadn't heard all morning. Everything's verified. Would you like that in hundreds or fifties? Marcus blinked. Hundreds. As she went to retrieve the cash, Marcus glanced around. The branch was old, a little underfunded, but the energy was different. Genuine greetings. Staff who looked like they belonged to the community they served. Respect. When Danielle returned and handed over the envelope, Marcus paused. Danielle, he said quietly, how long have you worked here? 6 years, she replied. And have you ever felt pressure to treat certain customers differently? She looked around, cautious. Not from my team, but sometimes corporate policy can be vague. There's been rumors. Marcus leaned in slightly. Rumors like? Like certain districts flag transactions by race, higher risk profiles. There it was, the rot, not shouted, not written down, just whispered, insinuated, passed from one training manual to another under the guise of discretion. He handed her a card. I'm putting together a task force. I'd like you to be on it. Danielle's eyes widened. Me? Yeah, I need people who see, not just what's happening, but what's being ignored. She took the card, stunned. Thank you. Marcus turned and left, the envelope still in hand. Outside, David waited beside the car. You were right, Marcus said as he approached. David raised a brow. About what? This isn't about what happened to me, Marcus said. It's about what we've allowed to happen to others while we look the other way. He opened the car door. That ends today. Because the bank may have had his name on the building, but it was time to put his values in its walls. By noon, the news had already begun to ripple through corporate hallways, Slack channels, and private WhatsApp groups. The CEO had been profiled, humiliated, inside his own institution, and the ones who watched, who said nothing, now found themselves with a weight pressing down on their conscience. But it wasn't the incident that woke them up. It was the fact that he didn't lash out. Marcus Bennett didn't shout. He didn't throw threats. He didn't demand loyalty. He just let the truth play out, and now it was impossible to ignore. Inside the 45th floor executive conference room of Bennett Financial HQ, an emergency boardroom meeting convened. The table stretched long and sleek, lined with high-back leather chairs filled by regional directors, senior compliance officers, and public relations executives scrambling to contain what was quickly becoming a national story. David Carter stood at the head of the table. Beside him, Marcus remained silent, hands folded, expression unreadable. But those who knew him well, those who had followed his rise from a modest loan officer to founder of one of the country's top-tier banks, could see the storm gathering behind his eyes. Before we begin, David said, his voice low but commanding, let's be clear. This meeting isn't about optics. It's about systemic accountability. A few execs shifted uncomfortably. One woman, Vanessa Cheng, VP of Risk Management, spoke first. We understand the severity of what happened, but to be fair, this was a single branch. A few bad apples. Marcus raised a hand. Just once. Vanessa stopped. No, Marcus said evenly. That excuse ends today. The room fell into uneasy silence. I built this bank to be different, Marcus continued. Not just profitable, not just polished, different, inclusive, just. We've spent millions branding ourselves as a progressive institution, but today we failed, and it wasn't isolated. He turned to the screen behind him. David tapped his tablet. A map appeared, highlighted branches across multiple states, each marked with a red dot. Beside each dot, a short summary. New York, New York. Black customer denied loan despite qualifying score. Dallas, Texas. Latina entrepreneur required to provide additional proof of ownership. Oakland, California. Muslim couple flagged for suspicious activity over a standard transfer. The list went on. Each red dot wasn't a data point. It was a scar. Marcus stepped back. I was profiled yesterday, but I'm not the first. I was just the one with the camera, the title, and the leverage to make you care. No one dared speak. Vanessa sank lower into her chair. Across from her, a man in a gray suit cleared his throat. What do you want us to do? David spoke up, tone sharp. Start acting like the mission on your brochures means something. But, the man tried again. PR is already working on a statement. If Marcus makes a formal apology video... An apology? Marcus snapped, his voice rising for the first time. To who? Me? I'm not the one who needs an apology. Our customers are. The ones you interrogate. The ones you dismiss. The ones you look straight through because they don't look like your idea of wealth. His words cracked the silence like thunder. Then from the far corner, a quiet voice broke in. I saw it happen. All heads turned. It was Lisa Parker, the same woman who had watched Marcus be dragged out earlier that day, now seated at the edge of the room, shoulders tight with guilt. I was in the lobby, she said, voice trembling. I watched the whole thing. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. A pause. Marcus didn't scold, didn't nod, just listened. Lisa continued. I've been with this bank for 19 years. I joined because I believed in what it stood for. But I let that belief make me passive. I didn't do anything. And that's the problem, isn't it? That silence is easier than courage. She looked up at Marcus, eyes glassy. I'm sorry. Marcus didn't respond right away, but he did step toward her. Thank you, he said quietly. Not for the apology, but for saying it out loud. Because acknowledgement is the first crack in denial. Lisa's confession rippled outward. One by one, others spoke up. A teller from Atlanta shared that she had witnessed a black college student asked to show his scholarship paperwork before depositing a check. A compliance officer admitted that he once flagged an account simply because the name sounded too foreign for the zip code. They hadn't come forward before. They were scared or unsure, or maybe, just maybe, they didn't think it was their place. But now they were awake. And with that awakening came a responsibility. Marcus stood at the front of the room again. We are not going to fix this overnight, but we will fix it from the inside. Every employee will undergo racial bias training, not just a seminar, not just a checkbox, but immersive, monitored programs led by external advocates. Anonymous reporting systems will be overhauled, promotions will be audited, and every decision made from this day forward will be reviewed with one question in mind. Would we have done the same if their skin was a different color? No applause, just a heavy, determined silence. The kind that meant change wasn't a performance, it was a vow. Marcus Bennett didn't wait for apologies. He didn't trust statements. What he trusted was data, documentation, evidence. Because in a world that constantly demanded proof of his legitimacy, he had learned to turn that same scrutiny back on the systems that dared to challenge his place within them. 2 days after the incident, Marcus sat alone in a private office high above the city, surrounded by silence and code. A laptop glowed in front of him, its screen filled with streams of internal bank data, transaction logs, flagged accounts, denial rates, customer complaints. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for patterns, and the numbers didn't lie. Across all Bennett Financial branches, white customers requesting withdrawals over $10,000 were approved 94% of the time on first attempt. For black customers, that rate dropped to 57%. Marcus zoomed in on the last 12 months of activity from the Chicago branch where it had all begun. He wasn't shocked, just grimly validated. Of 127 high-value withdrawal attempts by black customers, 81 had been delayed, questioned, or outright denied. Some were forced to provide additional identification. Others were told to wait days. A few, just like Marcus, were removed by security. He clicked a few keys, pulling up internal memos. One thread stood out. From Victoria Sanders to all staff, Bennett Financial Chicago. Subject, enhanced compliance expectations. Due to a rise in fraud cases, we are implementing additional screening for high-risk customers. Be vigilant. If a customer seems nervous, poorly dressed, or if their story feels inconsistent, escalate to management before approving large cash disbursements. There it was. No mention of race. But everyone in that room knew exactly who it was about. Marcus clenched his jaw. He'd hired Victoria personally 5 years ago. She had dazzled in interviews, fast talker, MBA from Wharton, perfectly rehearsed DEI talking points. He remembered thinking she might be the one to lead the Chicago flagship with both grace and toughness. But somewhere along the way, that polished image had corroded into something uglier. The same corporate rot Marcus had vowed to keep out of his bank had seeped in, quietly, slowly, and with a smile. He opened another window, employee incident reports. Teller after teller had filed minor complaints. Not formal grievances, just internal notes dropped in HR's suggestion box and promptly buried. One complaint from a junior black teller read, Amy Carter keeps asking to be moved to the low-risk queue. She says she feels more comfortable with regulars, but I've only seen her deny transactions when they're people of color. Another, Victoria told me to watch the ones with hoodies and accents. I asked if she meant anyone specific, and she said, you'll know when you see them. I felt uncomfortable, didn't know who to tell, and yet no action had been taken, no formal investigations. The system had let it all slide, masked under discretion and employee judgment. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, the weight of betrayal heavy in his chest. He had built this place to be a fortress against exactly this kind of erosion, but he hadn't watched closely enough, hadn't guarded the gates with the vigilance required when power's given, not seized. And now it was on him to fix it. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Jillian, I need the full HR archive for all branches. Internal complaints, exit interviews, unaddressed bias reports, everything that was flagged and ignored. There was a long pause on the other end. Then a quiet voice answered. Marcus, there's a lot. It'll take a day. I'll wait, he said, hanging up. The next morning, the files came in. It was worse than he expected. At the Miami branch, a Haitian small business owner was denied a business loan because the branch manager didn't believe the market for handmade soaps would be viable. At the Portland office, a transgender woman had her loan co-signer questioned for being too informal despite providing full documentation. And at the Los Angeles branch, a Korean-American father was asked, on record, if he could confirm his immigration status when applying for a mortgage refinance. Each case was a crack, each silence, a cover-up. Marcus stood at the window, the city sprawling before him in glass and steel. He could see the problem now, not as an incident, but as a structure. Prejudice here didn't wear a white hood or scream with slurs. It wore tailored suits, it spoke in policy codes and smiled during interviews. And the only way to fix it wasn't by firing a few names. It was by tearing out the foundation and rebuilding the ethics from the bones up. He picked up the phone again. This time he called the board. I'm authorizing an independent audit across all operations. Internal bias, hiring practices, customer treatment, every metric. We're bringing in an external firm. No ties to us. I want a report in 30 days. Marcus, the board chair said cautiously, this will be expensive. It'll stir things up. Investors? I don't care. He didn't raise his voice. But everyone on that call knew this wasn't negotiable. I'd rather lose investors than lose my soul. And with that, Marcus Bennett hung up. Behind him, the screen still glowed with numbers. But ahead of him, the path was clear. He wasn't just going to expose the rot. He was going to uproot it publicly. The conference room on the top floor of Bennett Financial's Chicago headquarters had seen its share of quarterly reports and investor presentations, but never a reckoning. At 9 a.m. sharp, Marcus Bennett walked in through the frosted glass doors, flanked by his legal advisor, Cynthia Morales, and his newly promoted chief of internal compliance, none other than Jamal Brooks. Jamal wore a crisp charcoal suit. The security badge that had hung from his hip for 5 years was gone, replaced with a sleek gold pin. Vice President, Compliance. The room went still as the executive team filed in. Regional managers, heads of departments, compliance officers, and most importantly, Victoria Sanders and Amy Carter. Neither had been officially terminated yet. They had been summoned for one final confrontation. Marcus wanted every stone turned over in the light. Victoria's face was unreadable. Amy looked pale, lips tight, eyes darting between people like she was already preparing her excuses. "Take your seats," Marcus said calmly. There was no ceremony, no pleasantries. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, hands clasped before him. His voice, low but clear, reverberated against the glass walls. "You all know why we're here." Silence. No one here is unaware of what happened last week at the Chicago branch. A customer was denied service, publicly humiliated, and physically removed from the premises based on nothing more than assumption. He let the weight of that word settle in the room. And that customer was me. Amy's face blanched. Victoria looked straight ahead. "I was treated like a fraud in the very institution I built. I was refused service. My identification discarded. My transaction denied. I was physically removed without cause. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was profiling. It was systemic." Cynthia stepped forward, setting a thick binder on the table. "Inside this report," she said, "you'll find 86 instances of racially biased decision-making across 7 branches of Bennett Financial, all within the last 2 years, all swept under vague phrases like discretion, risk-based protocols, and standard procedure. None of them investigated. None of them addressed." Murmurs rippled across the table. Marcus didn't raise his voice. "But today we address them." He turned his eyes toward Victoria. "Manager Sanders, would you like to explain why you approved a memo encouraging enhanced screening for customers who appeared nervous, poorly dressed, or inconsistent? Terms we now know were applied almost exclusively to black and brown clients?" Victoria cleared her throat. "That memo was based on rising fraud alerts. The language was coded," Marcus cut in, "and weaponized. You didn't write black or immigrant, but we both know who you meant. You created a culture of gatekeeping under the guise of vigilance." He turned to Amy. "And you followed it to the letter." Amy's mouth opened. I didn't mean to." "You didn't have to mean to," Jamal said from across the table, voice low but firm. "You just had to do it, over and over again." Marcus nodded to Cynthia, who opened the binder and began flipping pages. "Page 14, she said. "Amy Carter, 37 flagged interactions over the past 18 months, all with customers of color. Every time the result was either delayed service, increased documentation demands, or denial." Amy looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was just being careful." "You were being discriminatory," Marcus replied, calm but absolute. "You just didn't want to call it that." Victoria, still stiff-backed, spoke. "With all due respect, Marcus, I've worked in this industry for 2 decades. Risk-based vetting is standard." "And that's the problem," Marcus said. "When the standard allows for bias, the standard is broken." He paused. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to reset the standard." He looked around the table, locking eyes with every department head. "We've built something extraordinary, a bank founded on inclusion, innovation, and integrity. But those words mean nothing if we allow rot to settle beneath the surface. We will not hide behind policy. We will not tolerate bias masquerading as caution. and we will not protect anyone who uses their authority to devalue another human being. He turned to security, who had quietly entered the room during the last few minutes. Effective immediately, Marcus said, Victoria Sanders and Amy Carter are relieved of their positions. You are to vacate the premises and forfeit all access to client systems. Victoria's mask cracked at last. You can't be serious. I'm painfully serious, Marcus said. You're not just being fired, you're being audited. If internal review finds intentional misconduct, we'll escalate to legal proceedings. You weren't just bad actors. You were architects of harm. Amy, trembling, didn't even argue. She stood slowly, tears welling, and followed the guards out in silence. Victoria, seething, refused eye contact as she was escorted away. When the door shut behind them, Marcus turned to the rest of the room. You want to stay here? He asked. Then you rise to a new standard. He tapped the binder. Bias training is now mandatory for all staff, all branches, all levels. We're launching a third-party audit team. Every incident will be logged, reviewed, and addressed. I don't care how senior you are. If you let this slide again, you'll be next. The room was silent, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of people who finally saw the truth and knew it couldn't be ignored anymore. Marcus took a final breath. This is the line. Either we protect the dignity of every customer, or we become the thing we swore we'd replace. He turned to Jamal. You ready? Jamal gave a single, steady nod. Always. Marcus Bennett didn't stop at firing Victoria and Amy. He had seen too many organizations issue public apologies, only to sweep the truth back under the rug. That wasn't happening at Bennett Financial. Not under his leadership. Not in his name. By noon the following day, a formal press release hit every major financial and national news outlet. Bennett Financial CEO issues internal terminations after racial profiling incident at Chicago branch. Systemic overhaul in progress. It included a statement personally written by Marcus. This institution was built on the belief that financial services should empower, not exclude. What happened to me could have happened to any person of color walking through our doors. That is unacceptable, and it will never happen again. Within hours, the story went viral. CNN, CNBC, The Washington Post. Even smaller Black-owned publications like The Root and Blavity elevated the story as a rare case of direct corporate accountability, especially coming from a Black CEO in a white-dominated industry. But while the public praised him, inside Bennett Financial, the collapse had just begun. Marcus had ordered a complete internal audit across all 146 branches. It wasn't just paperwork. Cynthia Morales assembled a compliance task force of former regulators, civil rights attorneys, and HR ethics experts to review 5 years of customer service records, surveillance footage, employee evaluations, and complaint logs. What they found was disturbing, not just at the Chicago branch, but across the entire system. Branches in Atlanta, Dallas, and San Francisco had documented similar incidents. Large withdrawal delays, frozen accounts, or unexplained denials. Customers who looked out of place in upscale areas were subject to more ID checks and required manager sign-off. A clause that was applied almost exclusively to people of color. And worse, internal chat logs revealed employees casually referring to clients as high risk based solely on zip code or attire. Marcus stared at the findings in disbelief. These weren't isolated bad apples. This was structural rot. We've been building an empire, he told Cynthia one evening, but parts of it were laid on poisoned soil. She nodded. Then it's time to rebuild. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus did just that. He held a virtual town hall with every single Bennett Financial employee, over 9,000 attendees. No filters, no spin. He spoke plainly. You don't just work at a bank. You work at a reflection of society. If we replicate the same systems of bias, exclusion, and double standards that plague every institution outside these walls, then we're no better. In fact, we're worse, because we say we stand for something. He paused. Well, now we prove it. 3 major initiatives were announced that day. The Bennett Equity Review Board, an independent external panel with full access to employee reports and client complaints, authorized to recommend disciplinary action. Zero tolerance discrimination policy, One verified incident of bias or racial profiling would result in immediate termination. No warnings, no transfers, no second chances. The Opportunity Access Fund, a $15 million program to support underbanked communities, fund financial literacy workshops, and provide low-interest business loans to Black and brown entrepreneurs. The response was polarizing. Some longtime employees, especially those in senior roles, resigned immediately. Others stayed, but reluctantly. A few even pushed back, claiming the new policies were too harsh or anti-employee. One internal memo from a regional VP in Texas read, "We're creating a culture of fear. Not everyone who flags a customer is racist." Marcus's response, he fired the VP that afternoon. "No one's asking you not to do your job," he told the executive team. "But if your default assumption is that a Black customer in a hoodie is a threat, while a white man in a suit is trustworthy, then you don't understand what job you're in." The message was clear. Bennett Financial would no longer tolerate covert racism hiding behind the guise of standard procedures. Jamal Brooks, now Vice President of Compliance, took his new role seriously. He visited every regional branch personally, starting with the one in Chicago. The day he walked through the front doors, no longer wearing a security badge, but a tailored suit and a brass VP pin, the staff froze. Some looked relieved, others nervous. But Jamal didn't come to punish. He came to listen. He pulled aside the tellers, the janitors, the interns, asked them what they'd seen, how they'd felt, what they feared. For the first time, people who had once kept their heads down spoke up. "There was always a feeling," said Tanya, a teller, "like if you weren't blonde or bubbly, you had to work twice as hard to be seen as competent." A custodian added, "We've seen clients be treated differently. I thought it was just me imagining things." "No," Jamal said, "it wasn't your imagination. It was reality, and now it changes." By the end of that week, over a dozen new policies were implemented at the Chicago branch alone. Anonymous reporting systems, mandatory empathy training, and surveillance footage flagged not just for security, but for bias review. Employees who once enforced discriminatory rules now had to undergo extensive recertification or leave. The cracks in the system had become craters. But Marcus wasn't rebuilding for the sake of image. He was rebuilding for dignity, for justice, for every customer who had ever been told, implicitly or explicitly, that they didn't belong. And word began to spread. New clients flooded in. People who had closed accounts at other banks came back to Bennett. Young Black entrepreneurs, immigrant families, and people once denied loans finally felt seen. Because the CEO didn't just talk equity, he lived it. It had been 90 days since the scandal broke. 90 days since Marcus Bennett was dragged out of his own bank like a criminal. And now, standing at the grand stage of the National Financial Equity Summit in Washington, D.C., Marcus looked out over an auditorium packed with reporters, policymakers, and executives, many of whom had once dismissed him as too young, too bold, too different. But they couldn't dismiss him now. Not after what he'd done. Not after he turned public humiliation into systemic reform. 3 months ago, Marcus began, his voice resonating through the hall, I was mistaken for a threat inside the very institution I built from scratch. A hush fell over the room. He continued, that moment was not an exception. It was a mirror reflecting the quiet rot still embedded in the foundations of too many so-called modern institutions. We claim to be diverse. We celebrate progress on paper, but we fail in the lobby, at the counter, in the day-to-day decisions where unconscious bias becomes policy. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Let me be clear, Marcus said, his tone sharper now. It was not just Amy Carter or Victoria Sanders who failed. It was a system that allowed them to believe their actions were acceptable. A system that told them they'd be protected as long as they looked professional and followed vague protocol. He paused. That system no longer exists at Bennett Financial. He let the words sink in. Behind him, a screen illuminated a set of numbers. 146 branches audited. 63 internal investigations completed. 27 terminations for bias-related violations. 100% employee participation in equity and empathy retraining. The room was silent, But the message was thunderous. Marcus turned slightly and nodded toward a reserved section in the front row. There sat Jamal Brooks, now a senior VP, flanked by 3 young black interns he had personally recruited from Southside community colleges. This man, Marcus said, gesturing toward Jamal, was once paid to stand silently while injustice unfolded. Today, he leads our national reform strategy. He didn't rise by playing it safe. He rose by standing firm when it mattered. Jamal lowered his head slightly. A few attendees clapped, slowly at first, then louder, rising into a full standing ovation. Marcus waited for silence to return before moving on. But reform isn't enough, he said. Reform still plays within the confines of a broken system. What we need, what we've started, is rebirth. With that, he unveiled Bennett Financial's newest initiative, the Open Access Project, a radical plan to establish 10 new Bennett Financial branches in historically redlined neighborhoods, fully staffed by members of those communities. Each branch would feature fee-free checking accounts, microloan stations with same-day approval for small businesses, in-house financial literacy programs for youth and seniors, equity scholarships for employees seeking finance degrees, and perhaps most revolutionary, each location would operate under a community oversight council made up of educators, social workers, clergy, and small business owners. No boardroom ivory towers, real accountability, ground up. Money has always been a gatekeeper, Marcus declared. We're turning it into a bridge. The applause this time was instant, thunderous, but Marcus wasn't done. Let me speak now to every institution that's been watching in silence, to the banks, the firms, the universities, the tech giants. You have seen the fallout of our shame, but will you have the courage to follow our example? He leaned forward slightly. Because if your leadership is more concerned about optics than outcomes, if you're still holding diversity roundtables without changing your hiring matrix, if you're still celebrating first in 2025, then you're not leading, you're stalling. The audience was breathless. It was no longer just a speech, it was a reckoning. After the summit, reporters swarmed Marcus. Headlines the next morning captured his message. CEO Marcus Bennett redefines corporate responsibility. Forbes, from victim to vanguard, Bennett Financial's radical transformation. Bloomberg, he built the bank. They kicked him out. He fired them all. Washington Post. But Marcus didn't bask in the spotlight. Instead, he returned to Chicago the very next day. Not to his penthouse office, but to the South Side. He walked into the modest community center where Bennett Financial had just installed its first free access ATM, hugged the retired teacher who'd helped run the neighborhood credit union for 30 years, and sat on folding chairs with local residents to answer questions face to face. No cameras, no press, just a man and his mission. "Why did you come back here so soon?" someone asked him during the community Q&A. Marcus smiled. Because this is where change is supposed to start. Not in a summit ballroom, not in a headline, but here. A pause. With the people who were never supposed to walk into my bank without being questioned. With the ones we forgot while chasing quarterly goals. If I can't show up for them, I don't deserve to run anything. The crowd was silent. Then an elderly man stood up, tears in his eyes. "You're not just fixing a bank, son," he said. "You're restoring faith." Marcus nodded. "That's the plan." That night, as he walked back through the familiar Chicago streets where he once delivered newspapers to pay for textbooks, Marcus felt something shift in the air. It wasn't the wind. It was clarity. A new chapter had begun, not just for his company, but for how justice could look in corporate America. And it wasn't polished. It was raw, earned, real. The image of Marcus Bennett being shoved out of his own bank had once gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Now, 3 months later, a new video went even more viral, but this one told a different story. It began with a simple clip. Marcus, in a plain gray hoodie, holding the door open for a young mother and her son outside the brand new Southside Bennett Financial branch. No security, no entourage, no suits. Just the founder of a multi-billion-dollar institution welcoming everyday people with nothing more than humility and presence. That video wasn't scripted, it wasn't staged. A teenager recorded it on their phone and uploaded it with a single caption. This CEO doesn't need to prove anything. He just shows up. In under 24 hours, it hit 5 million views. But Marcus didn't care about views. He cared about legacy. Because what happened inside that bank wasn't just about a botched withdrawal. It was a symptom of something embedded so deep in the financial system that most didn't see it, unless they were the ones constantly asked to prove their worth, their identity, their belonging. Marcus had lived that reality. He had been that boy who was told banking wasn't for people like him. He had been that intern passed over despite outworking everyone in the room. He had been that voice in the meeting that got ignored until someone white said the exact same thing louder. So when Victoria Sanders looked him in the eye and dismissed him with rehearsed politeness, she didn't just misjudge a man, she activated a movement. Because power, when denied to the deserving, always finds another way to speak. In the months following the incident, Marcus launched the ID Initiative, a sweeping national reform campaign demanding transparency and anti-bias auditing across the financial industry. His goals were simple: end discriminatory transaction holds based on appearance, mandate anonymous review systems for large withdrawals, require all frontline staff to undergo unconscious bias retraining every 6 months, establish watchdog community boards for every major branch in metropolitan areas. By the end of the quarter, over 30 banks had signed on. Even institutions that once competed with Bennett Financial were forced to follow suit, because Marcus didn't just expose bias, he built the blueprint for eradicating it. But the true legacy wasn't in the policies, it was in the people. In Jamal Brooks, now leading a national mentorship program that paired young Black professionals with executive mentors in finance. In Lisa Parker, the woman who once stayed silent in the bank lobby, who now ran a local watchdog group holding her own financial institution accountable. In the dozens of customers who once feared rejection, now confidently walking into banks they used to avoid, because the door no longer judged them before they spoke. And yes, in Marcus himself, because he didn't stop at reform, he stayed in the trenches. Every Monday he met with community organizers. Every Friday he reviewed complaints from across his branches, personally responding to the ones involving racial bias. And every Sunday he went back to his grandmother's church, the place where he first learned what dignity meant. He knew that the system would try to forget, that headlines would fade, that Victoria Sanders and Amy Carter would eventually find jobs elsewhere, rebranded and rehabilitated. But Marcus wasn't interested in revenge. He was building memory, a living, breathing memory etched not in trauma, but in transformation. The kind of memory that tells a different story to the next generation. That power doesn't always wear a suit. That identity should never be grounds for suspicion. That silence can be violence, but presence can be protest. And that sometimes the quiet man at the counter, the one with sneakers instead of brogues, the one you assume is no one, might just be the architect of everything around you. As the sun set on another day, Marcus stood at the edge of the new Southside branch, watching kids bike past and elders wave from stoops. The building behind him wasn't just brick and glass anymore. It was a monument to justice. He didn't need statues. He didn't need plaques. He had this moment, this truth. A Black man walked into a bank he built and was thrown out because they didn't recognize him. And then he came back, not with vengeance, but with vision. And he built something no one could throw away again. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.